All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to strip away all those Hollywood myths and dive right into the wild, factual life of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. You know, if you think you know Mozart just because you've seen a couple of movies or heard a few symphonies, well, get ready. We are looking past the powdered wigs today. We're going to look at the real data, the actual letters, and the historical records that paint a picture of a guy who was, essentially, the very first 18th century rock star.
So, right off the bat, we got to ask ourselves, was Amadeus actually anything like the movies? We all kind of picture this giggling, infantile genius who just effortlessly pulled music right out of the heavens. But the real story? It's so much more fascinating than that. As we'll see, his actual life involved a highly demanding stage dad, some fierce rebellions against authority, crazy extravagant spending, and right at the very end, a genuinely creepy messenger dressed entirely in gray.
But to really understand the man, we have to go back to the beginning. During his early years, his father Leopold realized he had an absolute prodigy on his hands, and he essentially dragged 6-year-old Wolfgang all across Europe. And I mean, we are talking about performing for the absolute heavyweights of the 18th century. He played for Empress Maria Theresa in Vienna in 1762, King Louis XV in Paris in 1763, and King George III in London in 1764. The family really didn't care about the incredibly uncomfortable travel conditions back then. They had a prodigy, and they were gonna show him off.
But you have to understand, these legendary performances weren't exactly those classy, dignified recitals where everyone just sat quietly. As the historical sources point out, they were basically circus acts. Little Wolfgang was made to perform parlor tricks, like playing the harpsichord completely blindfolded, with a cloth covering the entire keyboard. He was improvising on whatever theme the audience shouted out. And while this tiny kid performed these jaw-dropping stunts, his father was in the background, literally counting the coins and managing the whole spectacle.
Which brings us to the guy pulling all the strings, Leopold Mozart. Look, he was undeniably an excellent musician and an incredibly gifted teacher. I mean, he literally wrote one of the most comprehensive violin teaching manuals of all time. But he became entirely overly obsessed with the family's financial gain. The historical records actually show Leopold meticulously tracking every single expense and income. He placed this massive debt on his son's shoulders, constantly pressuring Wolfgang with these obsessive financial demands, basically insisting the boy pay back the family for raising him.
So eventually, Mozart just had to break free. As a young adult, he was employed by the Archbishop of Salzburg, Hieronymus Colloredo. And Colloredo was distant, he had zero ear for music, and he basically treated Wolfgang like a disobedient servant. Exhausted and feeling totally disrespected, Wolfgang hit his breaking point. He rebelled. He developed this deep hatred for Salzburg, and in this massive, unprecedented step for his own artistic freedom, he broke ties and moved to Vienna in 1781. And this wasn't just some teenage rebellion. This was a historic move for the independence of artists everywhere. He was essentially setting the blueprint for the modern freelance musician.
And how did dear old dad handle this newfound independence? Yeah, not well. Not well at all. When Wolfgang announced he was marrying Constanze Weber against his father's wishes, Leopold sent him this incredibly intense, wildly dramatic prediction of doom. He wrote that you will end up trapped by some woman, die lying on a straw mattress in an attic full of starving children. Talk about a guilt trip, right? It completely chilled what used to be a very close father-son relationship.
But here's the thing, Leopold's apocalyptic prophecy couldn't have been more wrong. When Wolfgang and Constanze got married in August 1782, they actually lived in absolute luxury at first. Those early Vienna years brought in tons of cash through commissions, performances, and teaching. They were actually a really well-matched, harmonious couple, despite all those rumors of mutual infidelities. And as for Constanze, biographers love to unfairly paint her as frivolous, but the fact is she proved her resilience. She outlived Mozart and all of her harshest critics by over 50 years.
Okay, we absolutely cannot talk about Vienna without bringing up the elephant in the room, Antonio Salieri. You can just forget the whole black legend of murder plots and mortal enemies that you see in pop culture. The factual reality is way more nuanced than that. Yes, there was definitely professional friction, especially when Leopold Mozart accused Salieri's Italian cabal of plotting against Wolfgang's operas. But they also had a genuine professional camaraderie. They actually collaborated on a joint cantata in 1785. And, funnily enough, they both shared a rather close relationship with a beautiful soprano who happened to be Salieri's protected mistress.
Now, Mozart's ultimate dream was always the opera stage.
And he just churned out these masterworks with unbelievable speed, literally working out the entire structure in his head before he wrote a single note on paper. In 1782, he premiered The Abduction from the Seraglio, which was a huge hit, even though Emperor Joseph II famously and ridiculously complained that it simply had too many notes. Then came Figaro in 1786 and, of course, Don Giovanni in 1787, which became a massive, undeniable blockbuster hit over in Prague.
Let's just zoom in on the Marriage of Figaro for a second, because this brilliantly shows how Mozart navigated high society. The original play by Beaumarchais was famously banned in Vienna because of its dangerous anti-aristocratic themes of class struggle. So, to sneak it past the nervous Viennese censors, Mozart and his brilliant librettist, Lorenzo da Ponte, carefully toned down the explicit political messaging. But Mozart cleverly kept the razor-sharp social satire alive in the music itself. You hear it especially in the brilliantly ironic aria, Si vol ballare, where a servant is basically just openly mocking his master.
So he's having all these massive blockbuster hits, right? But despite that, by 1788, his financial reality took a terrifying nosedive. Mozart had a serious taste for the finer things. We're talking champagne, oysters, just a wildly extravagant lifestyle that completely outpaced his income as a chamber composer. Add to that the incredibly expensive spa cures Constanze needed over in Baden-Baden, and suddenly Mozart is sending these desperate letters, literally begging his friends and fellow Freemasons for loans. By 1791, he was facing severe financial hardship.
Now, this perfectly sets the stage for what is honestly a bizarre, true crime-style finale that feels like it belongs in a movie, but it's totally real. In mid-July 1791, a mysterious, completely unidentified man dressed entirely in gray arrives at the large gates of Mozart's home. He walks right through the courtyard, knocks on the door, and presents this anonymous, highly secretive commission for a requiem mass.
Okay, so here is the actual historical truth of what was going on behind the scenes. An aristocrat named Count von Walsegg had just been widowed, and he wanted a memorial piece for his wife. So he secretly hired Franz Anton Leitgeb, who was our mysterious man in gray, to act as a middleman. Why? Because the Count was fully planning to steal the music and pass Mozart's masterpiece off as his own original work.
But Mozart, he had no clue about the Count's scheme. He was already exhausted, massively stressed about money, and physically sick. So this bizarre level of secrecy rattled the composer to his absolute core. He totally spiraled. He genuinely started to believe that this somber man in gray was an envoy from the other world. In his deteriorating state, Mozart became absolutely convinced that he was actually composing his very own funeral march. I mean, how incredibly haunting is that?
And the really heartbreaking part is, he was right. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart passed away on December 5th, 1791. He was only 35 years old. The actual cause of his death is still a medical mystery even today. And because of his total financial ruin, the man who quite literally composed the soundtrack to the 18th century was buried in an unmarked communal grave, leaving that mysterious, legendary requiem unfinished forever.
Which leaves us with, well, a pretty massive question to think about. How does a guy who is treated like a literal circus act as a child, pushed to the absolute brink by his own father, and then buried in an unmarked pauper's grave at 35, manage to leave a legacy that still rules the world today? The Hollywood myths are fun for sure, but the factual reality of his flawed, frantic, and brilliant life, it is infinitely more powerful. Thanks for exploring the real Amadeus with me today.